Hey guys, tonight I want to tell you about the most famous little girl in American history and how nobody, not one person, stopped to wonder what happened to her when she grew old. Not because the story ended badly, not because the records were destroyed or the truth was buried, but because America decided very quietly, very deliberately, that the story was already over. The story ended with a wedding, with a small house on the Dakota Prairie, with a young woman named Laura and a young man named Almanzo, and the whole wide horizon of a frontier life stretching out ahead of them. America froze that image. It pressed it between the pages of a children's book and kept it there, forever warm, forever young, forever reaching toward the grass and the sky. But here is what nobody tells you. The real Laura kept getting older. The real Laura kept waking up every morning in a farmhouse in Missouri, answering fan letters from children who thought they knew her, watching an America she barely recognized roar and rattle past her window. And then, on the morning of October 23rd, 1949, she woke up and the man who had been lying next to her for 64 years was gone. She was 82 years old, and the world only remembered her as a little girl in a sunbonnet. That is where this documentary begins. Not on the prairie, not in the little house, not in the golden warmth of the television show that gave a generation its version of her. Here, in a 2-story farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri, in the autumn of 1949, with an empty chair and a very long silence. October 23rd, 1949. The Ozark Hills of southern Missouri have gone the colour of rust and amber by October. The mornings are sharp and cold, the kind of cold that comes in through the window gaps and settles into old joints and reminds a body that it has been working for 8 decades and it is tired. Rocky Ridge Farm, the farm that Laura and Almanzo Wilder had carved out of logged-over Ozark land more than 50 years before, is quiet this morning, the way a house goes quiet when something important has shifted inside it. Almanzo James Wilder was 92 years old when he died. The cause, according to the historical record, was 2 heart attacks. He died at the farm, at Rocky Ridge, the only permanent home the two of them had ever built together. 64 years of marriage. Think about that for a moment. Not 64 years of ease. Not 64 years of warmth and plenty. 64 years of diphtheria and crop failure and debt and grief and fire and drought, and the long, slow, grinding work of building something permanent out of nothing. They had buried an infant son. They had watched their first house burn. They had sat through the long winter when the train stopped running and the snow came sideways for months. They had moved again and again and again across the disappearing frontier until finally, in 1894, they had come to this hillside in Missouri with $100 and a 7-year-old daughter named Rose and a writing tablet in which Laura had been keeping a diary of the journey. And they had stopped moving. That is not a small thing. For people who had moved as many times as Laura and Almanzo Wilder had moved, from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota, back to Wisconsin to South Dakota to Missouri, stopping was not just a practical decision. Stopping was an act of faith. It was a declaration that this place, this particular hillside, this specific farmhouse, was the place they had been trying to reach all along. Rocky Ridge was not inherited comfort. It was not a gift. It was not easy. It was built. Year by year, season by season, failure by failure, and small triumph by small triumph. The farmhouse that exists today, the 2-story frame house where Laura wrote the Little House books by hand on tablets of paper, took years of labour and modest prosperity to complete. The orchards were planted 1 tree at a time. The gardens were dug by hand. The rock house that Rose built with her own earnings from her writing career went up in the 1920s on a ridge above the main farm. By the 1930s, when the Little House books began to appear and the fan mail began to arrive in serious quantities, Rocky Ridge Farm had become something extraordinary, a working homestead and a literary monument simultaneously. Carloads of visitors stopped by almost daily, wanting to meet the Laura of the books. Laura received them all. She answered letters. She shook hands, she posed for photographs, and then she went back inside and sat at her desk, in the farmhouse she and Almanzo had built, and kept living her actual life, the life that nobody was writing about. Now I need you to hold something in your mind. There is a chair in the Rocky Ridge farmhouse. It is Almanzo's chair. You can see it today if you visit the museum. The house is preserved largely as it was when Laura died in 1957. His things are still there, his workbench, his tools, the ordinary domestic residue of a man who spent 60 years building and repairing and maintaining the physical world that made the books possible. After October 23rd, 1949, that chair was empty. Not in a dramatic, theatrical way. Not in the way grief is performed in stories. Just empty in the ordinary, devastating way that a chair becomes empty when the person who sat in it every morning for 64 years is not going to sit there anymore. We will come back to that chair. Laura's reaction to Almanzo's death is not something the historical record documents in theatrical detail. What we know, from biographies, from surviving correspondence, from institutional records, is this. She was devastated. She was determined to remain independent, and she refused to leave Rocky Ridge. Rose Wilder Lane, Laura's only surviving child, by this point a prominent journalist and political writer living in Connecticut, asked her mother to come and live with her, to leave the farm, to be closer to family, to have daily care and company. Laura said no. That refusal, quiet, firm, unambiguous, is the first thing that tells you something true about the woman that the Little House books don't quite capture. Because here is the reality of that decision. Laura was 82 years old. She had lived through enough hardship to fill 10 ordinary lifetimes. She had a daughter who could provide comfort and company and care. She had every practical reason to accept that offer and leave Rocky Ridge. And she looked at the empty chair and the desk where she had written the books, and the orchards she and Almanzo had planted together, and the view from the farmhouse windows that she had been looking at since 1894, and she said, "I am staying." The word she had been writing about her whole life, the word she had built the entire Little House series around, was home. And home, for Laura Ingalls Wilder, was not a feeling you carried inside you wherever you went. Home was a specific place on a specific hillside in Missouri, built with specific hands over specific decades, and she was not going to leave it because one of the two people who built it was gone. She would stay, and that is where the 7 years begin. Now, I said nobody wrote about these years. That is not entirely accurate, and I want to be precise here, because this documentary is about truth. Multiple biographers, Caroline Fraser, whose Prairie Fires won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018, Pamela Smith Hill, Johnny Miller, William Anderson, have all addressed Laura's final years in their scholarly work. This story has been examined. What it has never been is told, not to the audience that loves Laura, not to the people who grew up with the books, not to the millions of women who feel like they know her. The scholarly record exists. The emotional reality of those 7 years has been quietly overlooked. That is what this documentary corrects. Here is a fact that will sit with you differently as the night goes on. Laura Ingalls Wilder spent the last years of her life growing more famous by the month. She was not forgotten. She was not ignored. She was not pushed aside or dismissed. She was celebrated, honoured, written about in newspapers, visited by fans who drove hours to stand outside her farmhouse just hoping for a glimpse of the woman from the books. And she spent those same years essentially alone in the house, looked after by a circle of neighbours and friends, writing letters by hand, watching the 1950s rewrite the world around her, and carrying in a desk drawer a manuscript she'd never tried to publish, the darkest book she ever wrote, about the diphtheria, the dead infant son, and the house fire of her early marriage. That manuscript would stay in the drawer until 14 years after she died, and the most famous woman in American children's literature was sitting alone in a farmhouse in Missouri with a hidden manuscript in her desk, and the whole country thought her story was already over. Now let's talk about what alone actually meant for Laura, because the word is important, and I do not want it misunderstood. Laura Ingalls Wilder was not abandoned. She was not locked away. She was not ignored by everyone who knew her. The record shows clearly that after Almanzo's death, she was looked after by a circle of neighbours and friends. She had a driver who took her into Mansfield regularly to do her errands, attend church, and visit friends. She maintained active correspondence with her editors, fans, and other friends throughout these years. But there is a kind of aloneness that has nothing to do with how many people come through your door. It is the aloneness of being the last person in the house who remembers how it was built. It is the aloneness of waking up and reaching for a routine that organised itself around another person. The sounds they made, the chair they sat in, the rhythm of two people moving through a shared space and finding that routine gone. It is the aloneness of being famous for a childhood that no one around you actually shared. Every child who loved the Little House books loved a Laura who was 8, 12, 16. They loved the Laura who ran across the prairie and helped Pa bring in the hay and nearly froze in the blizzard and married Almanzo on a summer afternoon and rode away in a wagon toward the future. That Laura was permanent, preserved, and frozen in print. The real Laura was 82 years old and her husband had just died, and she was sitting in a farmhouse in Missouri with autumn coming on. Those are two very different women, and for 7 years only one of them was keeping Laura company. I said we would come back to the desk. Here it is. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote all 8 of the Little House books at Rocky Ridge Farm. She wrote them by hand, tablet after tablet of penciled manuscript, which she then revised and typed up before sending to her publisher. The desk in her study is still there today. The museum preserves the room essentially as she left it. That desk had been the site of creation for over 2 decades. From Little House in the Big Woods in 1932 through these happy golden years in 1943, it was the place where living memory became children's literature. But by 1949 the creation was over. The books were finished. The series was complete. The literary work of Laura Ingalls Wilder, the work by which the world knew her name, was done. The desk was still there. But now, instead of manuscripts going out, something else was coming in. Fan letters, hundreds of them, from children who felt they personally knew her, from teachers who used the books in their classrooms, from adults who had grown up with the books and wanted to tell her what they meant, from mothers reading the books aloud to their own children by lamplight, just the way Ma had read to Laura. And Laura answered them, by hand, at the same desk where she had written the books. The desk that had once been the place where the past became literature was now the place where the past kept returning to her, in the handwriting of strangers who loved the girl she used to be. We will come back to that desk. Well, before we go further, I want to give you the full weight of what October 1949 actually meant, not just emotionally but historically. Almanzo Wilder died on October 23, 1949. He was 92 years old. He had been born in 1857, the same year that Gustave Flaubert published Madame Bovary, the same year that the Supreme Court delivered the Dred Scott decision, the same year that the last of the great clipper ships were being built for the China trade. Almanzo Wilder had been born into a world where horses were the primary engine of American civilization. He died in a world with nuclear weapons. Between those two facts is the span of one man's life, a life spent farming, building, surviving, and quietly being the husband of the most famous pioneer woman in American history. And Laura, who was 15 months younger than Almanzo, had shared almost that entire arc. She was born in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War. She had spent her childhood moving across a frontier that was disappearing faster than her family could settle it. She had written books that made that frontier permanent in the American imagination, and in the autumn of 1949, with the Soviet Union having just tested its first atomic bomb and NATO having just been formed and the Korean War 6 months from beginning, this woman, this 82-year-old widow in a Missouri farmhouse, was the last living keeper of a world that had vanished. Nobody came to tell her that, but she knew it. The farmhouse at Rocky Ridge had one more secret that the fan mail and the museum visits did not know. By the time Almanzo died in 1949, Laura and Almanzo did not technically own the farm in the way most people imagine. In 1948, the year before Almanzo's death, they had sold the farm property and surrounding acreage to a farmer named Shorter. But they had retained what the law calls a life estate, the legal right to remain in the farmhouse, the barns, and the grounds for the rest of their natural lives. After Almanzo died, that life estate belonged to Laura alone, She was living in a house she had built, on land she had once owned, that now legally belonged to someone else. The woman who had spent her entire career writing about the meaning of home was spending her final years in a home that was no longer hers. There is something extraordinarily quiet and painful about that fact. We will come back to that word, home, before this documentary ends. The final image of Chapter 1 is this. October 1949. Rocky Ridge Farm. The leaves are going. The mornings are cold. The house is the same house it has been since the turn of the century. The same desk, the same rooms, the same view from the same windows, but the chair is empty. And the woman who sat in that house for 50 years, who wrote 8 books about what it meant to build a home from nothing and survive everything the world threw at you, that woman is now facing the one thing the books never had to prepare her for. Not a blizzard, not a drought, not a creditor knocking at the door, just the specific, patient, unrelenting weight of living in a house that was built for 2 when one of the 2 is gone. What does she do now? That is Chapter 2. Stay with me, because the story is just beginning, and the strangest part, the part that will change how you think about the Little House books forever, hasn't happened yet. Here is something nobody ever thinks about. When a 64-year marriage ends, it does not just end emotionally, it ends physically. The sounds change, the smells change. The rhythms of a house built around 2 people, the particular weight of a footstep in the hallway, the specific hour that supper was expected, the unconscious domestic choreography of 2 people moving through the same rooms for 6 decades. All of that collapses on a single October morning, and you are left not just without a person, you are left inside a house that still holds the shape of someone who is no longer there. That is what Rocky Ridge Farm became on October 23rd, 1949. Not a monument, not a museum. A house that had been organised around 2 people, and was now organised around 1. Now, before you settle into a comfortable picture of a gentle old widow quietly passing her days, I need to stop you, because that picture is wrong. Laura Ingalls Wilder, at 82 years old, was not fragile. She was not decorative. She was not sitting in a rocking chair waiting for the end. She had survived the death of a child, the near death of her husband from diphtheria, crop failure, fire, the Great Depression, and 6 decades of frontier economics. And she had done it by being, at her core, a person who did not yield easily. But surviving practical hardship and surviving the specific weight of domestic absence are not the same skill. You can endure a blizzard by going inside and waiting it out. You cannot endure the silence of a house the same way. The silence just sits there. Let's look honestly at what Laura's daily world actually contained after October 1949, because the documentary record is specific enough that we can speak to it, and honest enough to acknowledge where it goes quiet. She did not leave Rocky Ridge. We established that. What she had in terms of human connection was this. Neighbours in Mansfield who had known her and Almanzo for decades. A small-town community with the particular quality of small-town familiarity. The kind where people check on you not because you asked, but because they have watched your kitchen light come on every morning for 30 years. Fan letters, hundreds of them. Children writing to her from across America, calling her by her first name, sending valentines and birthday cards and drawings, asking her questions about Pa and Ma and Mary and Carrie and the fiddle and the Prairie, and Rose, her daughter, living not at Rocky Ridge, but somewhere else, managing her own career, her own life, her own restless intellectual orbit. Rose visited. Rose wrote. Rose was not absent, but Rose was not there. Those 3 things, neighbours, letters, an intermittent daughter, were the architecture of Laura's social world after Almanzo died. Now ask yourself, is that abandonment? No, it is not abandonment. Is it loneliness? Yes. A very specific, very modern, very American kind of loneliness. The kind that is surrounded by people who love you and still has a quality of silence that they cannot fill. Almanzo Wilder had not, in his final years, been the vigorous man who drove a team of horses through a Dakota blizzard at 25. He was 92 when he died. The diphtheria he had contracted in the winter of 1887 to 1888 had left a permanent partial paralysis in his legs, a condition documented in the first 4 years' manuscript and confirmed by multiple biographers. He had lived with that disability for over 60 years. By the end, he moved slowly, sat more than he stood, occupied the house in the particular quiet way that an elderly body occupies a space. Present, warm, real, essential. What he provided in those last years was not dramatic. It was not heroic. It was the ordinary, irreplaceable presence of a person who's been beside you so long that their existence has become part of the background structure of your own consciousness. When that background goes silent, the silence is not just empty, it is loud. So here is what Laura did. She answered the letters. This is worth pausing on. Not as a charming biographical detail, but as a window into something real about who she was. According to Dear Laura, letters from children to Laura Ingalls Wilder, children had been writing to her for years before Almanzo died. From every state, from different countries, in handwriting that ranged from the careful printing of a 7-year-old to the cursive of a teenager who felt, genuinely, that Laura was a personal friend. And for as long as she physically could, Laura wrote back, by hand, from Rocky Ridge. Think about what that required of her. She was in her early 80s. Her handwriting was still clear. You can see it in the photographs. But she was not a young woman. Every letter she wrote was an act of deliberate effort. She could have stopped. She could have asked Rose to send a form letter. She could have told her publishers to handle it. She wrote back herself. Why? Because those children were writing to her, not to a publisher, not to an institution, to the woman who had told them about the fiddle and the Christmas candy and the long winter, and she had enough respect for that bond to respond to it personally. That is character. Not nostalgia, not sentiment. Character. But here is the other side of that desk. Those children were writing to someone who, in their minds, was permanently 7 years old. They were writing to little Laura, the girl who rode horses bareback across the Dakota Prairie, who helped build a little house with Pa, who played in Silver Lake in the summer and survived the long winter eating ground wheat. The Laura who was young and strong and perpetually beginning. They were not writing to an 82-year-old widow in a Missouri farmhouse, answering correspondence beside the empty chair of a man who had been dead for 2 years. They did not know about that woman. They had not been given her. And Laura sat at her desk, the same desk, the one where the Little House books had been written by hand on those tablets of paper, and wrote back to children who loved a version of her that had ended 40 years before they were born. That desk was not just where she had turned memory into literature. It had become the place where she maintained a conversation with people who knew only the myth. We will come back to that desk. Now, the farm itself. Rocky Ridge in 1950 looked different than Rocky Ridge in 1934, when the books were being written with Almanzo still planting and repairing and moving through the property with the particular energy of a man who has been a farmer his entire life. By 1950, the active farming was long finished. The dairy operation that had once been the financial backbone of the property had wound down decades earlier. The orchards were there, apple trees that Laura and Almanzo had planted, that had grown into mature trees over 50 years. But the labour-intensive agriculture of the early years was over. The farm was, essentially, a residence now. A well-tended, carefully maintained residence. Because Laura was not a person who let things deteriorate if she could help it, but no longer the working agricultural enterprise it had been. And Laura was no longer the woman who drove into Mansfield to conduct business, attend meetings, and move through the town with the easy familiarity of a long-established resident. She was there, still there. But the radius of her daily life had begun, quietly and incrementally, to contract. Trips into town became less frequent. The ground she moved through, the farmhouse itself, the garden, the immediate property, became the primary territory of her days. This is not a dramatic collapse. It is the ordinary arithmetic of aging, the slow subtraction of distance that happens when the body begins to negotiate more carefully with the world. But for a woman whose entire biography had been defined by movement, by covered wagons and claim shanties and new territories and fresh starts, the contraction was its own kind of loss. The woman who had crossed the Dakota Prairie in a wagon was now most comfortable within a quarter mile of her own front door. And here is something that the official version of Laura's story almost never touches. By 1950, Laura Ingalls Wilder was quite possibly the last living person who had direct embodied memory of the world she had spent her career documenting. Not the last person who remembered the 1870s and 1880s generally. Not the last person who had lived in rural America during that period. The last person who had been inside that specific combination of events, those specific blizzards, those specific people, that specific sequence of homes and migrations and survivals, that made the Little House books the particular thing they were. Mary Ingalls had died in 1928, Grace Ingalls Dow in 1941, and Carrie Ingalls Swansea in 1946, just 3 years before Almanzo. One by one, the people who appeared as characters in the books had died. Now Almanzo was gone too. And Laura sat in Missouri, the sole surviving custodian of a world that existed in living memory only in her. Every winter after 1949, she was the last person on Earth who remembered Pa's fiddle as a physical sound, not as a literary image on a page, not as a recreation on a museum stage, but as the actual specific sound of her father's actual hands on actual strings in an actual room that no longer existed. She was the last person who knew what Ma's voice had actually sounded like. The last person who had felt the specific cold of the long winter as a physical sensation in her own body, not as a story. The books had given millions of readers a version of that world. But the living memory of it, irreplaceable, embodied, untranslatable, was hers alone. And it was getting heavier, not lighter, with each passing year. Now, I want to introduce something that most people who know Laura's story have never considered. In 1947, while Almanzo was still alive, a young illustrator named Garth Williams had been commissioned by Laura's publisher to re-illustrate the entire Little House series. Williams was not an unknown talent. He had recently illustrated Charlotte's Web, a book that would become one of the most beloved in American literary history. His assignment with the Little House books was to create what would become, for generations of readers, the definitive visual image of who Laura was. He took his work seriously in a way that matters to this story. He visited Rocky Ridge Farm. He met Laura. He made sketches from her own photographs. He travelled to the actual sites where the Ingalls family had lived, the locations in Wisconsin, South Dakota, Kansas, before he drew a single finished illustration. And then he wrote something about what he found when he met the elderly Laura Ingalls Wilder at Rocky Ridge. He wrote, "She understood the meaning of hardship and struggle, of joy and work, of shyness and bravery. She was never overcome by drabness or squalor. She never glamorized anything, yet she saw the loveliness in everything. That is not a description of a sweet grandmother. That is a description of a person with a particular way of seeing, a discipline of perception that had been built by real experience, not sentiment." Williams saw it. He came to Missouri to find a woman who matched the books, and he found a woman who was more than the books. He went back to his studio and drew the girl in the sunbonnet. The girl, again, perpetually young, because that is what the books required. That is what the audience needed. That is what would sell. Not the 80-year-old woman with the clarity in her eyes that Williams had seen at Rocky Ridge. The little girl, the beginning, the sunbonnet. The re-illustrated editions would be published in 1953, which means that during the first years of her widowhood, while Laura was still adjusting to the new silence of Rocky Ridge, still answering the letters, and still making the slow incremental accommodations of aging, her books were being prepared for a new generation of readers with a new visual identity. Laura's childhood was being republished. The girl she had been at 7 was being redrawn by a man who had met her at 80. And the two images, the girl in the new illustrations and the widow in the farmhouse, had almost nothing in common except the name. Here is the question that the next 4 years would force into sharper and sharper focus. What happens when the gap between who you are and who the world believes you to be becomes so wide that you can no longer fully occupy either identity? The children who wrote to Laura at Rocky Ridge in 1950 and 1951 loved little Laura. They felt they knew little Laura. They sent her valentines. They called her by her first name. They told her about their own families because they felt she was part of theirs. What they were actually writing to was an elderly woman who had been a widow for 1 year, then 2, who was managing her own household, answering her own correspondence, living inside the silence of a house built for 2, and carrying somewhere in her desk a manuscript about the worst years of her life that she'd never tried to publish. The letters kept coming. The mythology kept growing. The woman at the desk kept writing back in her clear handwriting from Rocky Ridge Farm in Missouri. And every time she signed her name, Laura Ingalls Wilder, she was signing a name that meant something entirely different to the child holding the envelope than it meant to the woman holding the pen. Lame. Here we will come back to that manuscript, not yet, but soon. Because what is in that drawer is the part of Laura's story that the books never told, and the reason it stayed hidden tells you something important about the woman herself, something that the sunbonnet never shows you. But first, I need to tell you about a man named Garth Williams, and a box of new books, and the particular experience of sitting in a quiet farmhouse in Missouri in 1953, holding copies of your own memories, redrawn by someone else's hand, for someone else's children. That is where Chapter 3 begins. There is something strange about seeing yourself through someone else's eyes. Not a mirror, not a photograph, and something stranger, an artist's interpretation of a version of you that no longer exists. A face rendered in ink by a man who was not there. A childhood translated into lines and shadow by someone born 9 years after the events he was drawing. That is what arrived at Rocky Ridge Farm in 1947. His name was Garth Williams. He had just finished illustrating Charlotte's Web, a book about the unbearable grief of losing something you love, wrapped inside a story quiet enough for children to hold. Harper Brothers had sent him to Missouri with a specific purpose, to redraw the entire Little House series from scratch. Every book, every character. A new visual identity for a new generation of American readers. And so he came to the farmhouse, to the desk, to the woman who was by then 80 years old and 3 years away from losing Almanzo. We do not have Laura's recorded words from that meeting. The historical record goes quiet at the exact moment we most want it to speak. What we know is that Williams visited Rocky Ridge, that he studied photographs, that he spoke with Laura, that he absorbed what he could about a world he had never lived inside. What we do not know, what no surviving document confirms, is precisely what Laura felt, watching a stranger prepare to draw her face as a child. But here is what we can say. She had spent 40 years building her own version of that face. In the books she had shaped young Laura carefully, softening certain edges, brightening certain rooms, choosing which griefs would show and which would stay private. The Laura of the books was her construction. She had held authorship over the girl in the sunbonnet for 4 decades, and now she was handing the image over. The re-illustrated editions appeared in 1953. 6 years had passed since Williams's visit. Almanzo had been dead for 4 years by then. Laura was 86 years old, and her world had continued its gradual contraction. Fewer trips into Mansfield, more hours in the downstairs rooms, the desk still present, still waiting, still holding whatever it held in its drawer. And then the books came back to her. New bindings, new pictures, her own childhood, the big woods, the prairie, the long winter, the golden years, redrawn by a man from New York City in a style that would become, for millions of American children across the next 7 decades, the only visual version of that childhood they would ever know. Garth Williams's illustrations became canonical almost immediately. His Laura, the girl with the dark braids, the small determined face, the quality of a child who has looked at hardship and decided not to flinch, became the Laura that generations of schoolchildren held in their hands, his Almanzo as a young man, his Pa by the fiddle, his Ma at the stove, his Mary, graceful and golden-haired in the years before blindness, his Carrie and Grace, small and peripheral in ways that would have mattered deeply to the real women they represented. By 1953, all of those real women were gone. Mary had died in 1928, Carrie in 1946, Grace in 1941, Laura was the last one. and she was sitting in Missouri holding a book about her own childhood, looking at someone else's pictures of her own face. Think about that for a moment. Not the achievement of it, not the legacy. Think about the particular, quiet strangeness of it. Every face in those illustrations belonged to someone Laura had actually known. Her father's face, her mother's face, the face of her sister who went blind at age 14 and spent the rest of her long life, until 1928, 56 years, living with that loss. Every face had a real person behind it. Every person behind it was dead. And now a stranger had drawn them all back to life, softly, carefully, in a style that belonged entirely to 1953, not to 1873, not to 1880, not to the specific irreplaceable texture of any of those years. The books had always been Laura's translation of her childhood. Now someone had retranslated the translation, and the new version was the one that would last. And here is the question the outline keeps circling without quite landing on, and it deserves a direct answer. How did Laura feel about what she saw? The surviving letters from this period are not comprehensive. Historians and biographers, Caroline Fraser in Prairie Fires, Pamela Smith Hill in her careful editorial work on Pioneer Girl, note that Laura's correspondence in the early 1950s continued, but that her documented reactions to the Williams illustrations specifically are not richly preserved in the primary record. What the record suggests, according to biographers working from the available letters, is that Laura engaged with the re-illustration process with cooperative goodwill rather than resistance. She worked with Williams during his visit. She offered him access. She did not, as far as the surviving evidence confirms, protest or reject what he created. But goodwill and emotional simplicity are not the same thing. A woman who had spent a lifetime choosing exactly which version of her life to make public, who had written a raw, dark manuscript about the worst years of her marriage and placed it in a drawer rather than publish it, was not a woman who would have felt nothing complicated about the reimagining of her childhood. The historical record is silent on the exact shape of that complexity, which is itself part of the story. Because that silence, the gap between what we know happened and what we know Laura felt about it, is the same silence that surrounds almost every significant event of her final years. The books returned, re-illustrated, newly distributed, to a generation of American children who were watching I Love Lucy on television sets, purchased on installment plans, living in suburban houses built by the GI Bill, attending consolidated schools that no longer bore any resemblance to the one-room schoolhouses Laura had described. The world doing the reading in 1953 was not even faintly similar to the world being read about. And somewhere in that gap, between the 1870s Prairie and the 1950s suburb, between the original Helen Sewell illustrations and Garth Williams's canonical redrawing, between the girl in the sunbonnet and the 86-year-old widow at her desk in Mansfield, something had happened to the story that Laura could not have fully anticipated when she began writing it in her 60s. The story had escaped her, not violently, and not through theft or betrayal or conspiracy. It had escaped the way all significant stories eventually escape their authors, slowly, through multiplication, through each child who read the books and formed a personal, private, irreplaceable relationship with a version of Laura that was partly real and partly their own invention, through each teacher who assigned the books as documents of pioneer heritage rather than as one woman's carefully shaped memoir, through each reprinting, each new edition, each set of new illustrations that added another layer of interpretation between the original experience and the reader's imagination. By 1953, Little House in the Big Woods had been in print for 21 years. 21 years is long enough for the first generation of readers to have children of their own, who would now read the same books in Garth Williams' new pictures and call it the original. And here is where we need to pause, because before we go any further into what came next, the award, the draw, the terrible quiet autumn of 1956, we need to sit for a moment with what Laura's correspondence reveals about what the letters meant to her. Not the fan mail as an abstract concept, the letters themselves, the specific, handwritten, child-scripted letters that arrived at Rocky Ridge through the 1950s, from girls in Ohio and women in California and children who spelled her name wrong and said they felt like they knew her personally, felt like they were Laura, felt like the big woods and the long winter were places they had actually been. Laura answered them, by hand, with a pen, one at a time. The collection published as Dear Laura, letters from fans compiled after her death, gives us a window into what that correspondence looked like from the outside. Children asking whether the stories were true, children asking whether Pa was really as musical as the book said, children asking if she missed the Prairie, women writing to say the books had gotten them through something hard, a move, a loss, a winter that felt too long. She answered as many as she could. Think about what that took, not just physically, the pen, the paper, the aging hands, the failing eyesight that biographers note was declining through this period, but emotionally. Every letter was written by someone who loved a version of Laura that was younger than the person holding the pen by more than 70 years. Every letter addressed itself to the Sunbonnet Girl. The fiddle songs, the winter wheat, the prairie sky. Every letter arrived from a world that had decided the story was finished and the ending was happy. And Laura sat at the desk, the same desk, and answered. The desk that had once been the place where she turned raw memory into literature had become the place where she tended the mythology that literature had produced. Same desk, completely different weight. But the manuscript was still in the drawer, the first 4 years. The book she'd written during roughly the same period as the rest of the series, but never revised, never submitted, never offered to Harper Brothers, never shown to the children who wrote to her about Pa's fiddle and Ma's cooking and the warmth of the little house in winter. And here is what makes that manuscript quietly devastating, the more you sit with it. The first 4 years covers the opening of Laura and Almanzo's married life, the years from 1885 to 1889, the diphtheria that struck both of them in 1887, the illness that left Almanzo with a partial paralysis in his legs that he carried for the remaining 62 years of his life, the weakness that made the wagon team harder to manage, the heaviness of gait that visitors noticed when they met him in later years, the infant son born in August 1889, unnamed in the manuscript, a boy who lived 27 days and then died, the house fire that destroyed what they had built, occurring not long after the baby's death, the grinding, demoralizing financial failure of those early homestead years, the hail, the drought, the cost of everything, the weight of debt against a body of land that kept refusing to yield enough. She wrote all of it. She wrote it in the third person, because she had not yet shaped it into the first-person voice of the children's series. She wrote it without the softening she had applied to every other volume. She wrote it without the narrative architecture of hardship survived and transcended that made the other books bearable for children to read. And she put it in the drawer. Why? That question is one of the most important in this documentary, and the honest answer requires real intellectual honesty. We do not know with certainty. There is no surviving letter, none that biographers have published, in which Laura explains precisely why she withheld this manuscript. The historical record is silent on her reasoning in a way that leaves room for several interpretations, all of which are legitimate. She may have felt the book was too raw, too close, that revising it would have required returning to grief she had already survived and had no desire to re-enter. The baby who lived 27 days. The body she and Almanzo buried in Dakota Territory in 1889. The illness that crippled the man she had chosen and spent 64 years beside. She may have felt it violated the emotional register she had established for the children's series, that it belonged to a different kind of book entirely, one she'd never intended to publish. She may simply have decided at some private moment no document records that some things were hers, not the reading public's, not Harper Brothers, not even Rose's, hers. What the historical record confirms is only this. The manuscript existed. It was in the desk. It was there through the years of Almanzo's death, through the fan mail, through Garth Williams's visit and the new illustrations and the award from the American Library Association. It was there in 1953 when the re-illustrated books arrived. It was there in the autumn of 1956 when Rose came for Thanksgiving and found her mother delirious. It was there on February 10th, 1957. It was found in the desk after Laura died. Harper & Row published it in 1971, 14 years after her death. It remains the only Little House book written in the third person. It remains the darkest by a significant margin. It is the one most readers discover late, if they discover it at all. It is the one that does not fit neatly into the mythology. It is the version of the story that Laura kept for herself. And in 1953, while the re-illustrated editions were moving through American bookstores and schoolrooms, and the hands of children who felt they personally knew the girl in Garth Williams' pictures, the woman who had originally lived that childhood was 86 years old, sitting in the farmhouse she had stopped owning a year before Almanzo died, answering letters and keeping the dark manuscript in the drawer. The books kept getting younger. She kept getting older. That is the contradiction. Not a dramatic one, not a scandal, just the quiet, patient, inexorable contradiction at the centre of a life that lasted long enough to watch its own mythology form and solidify and become something the original person could no longer fully recognise as hers. The Garth Williams. Laura looked out from bookstore shelves with a child's clear eyes. The real Laura's eyes were failing. The Garth Williams. Laura stood on the prairie with a full open future ahead of her. The real Laura had lived all of that future already and was now living in the silence after it. The Garth Williams. Laura was a child who did not know yet what she would lose. The real Laura knew exactly what she had lost, and when and how each loss had felt. And still she sat at the desk. Still she answered the letters. Still she got up in the morning in the house that was the only place she had ever truly chosen to stay. And she lived another day in the farmhouse that held 60 years of accumulated life and one drawer's worth of the grief she never published. Which brings us to 1954. A year after the re-illustrated editions arrived. 5 years after Almanzo died. 87 years old. Something was coming. Something the country had finally decided Laura deserved. Something she would put in a drawer. She had outlived everything that made the books possible. By the summer of 1954, every person who had sat around the dinner table in the stories, Pa, Ma, Mary, Carrie, Grace, Almanzo, was gone. The prairie itself, the specific stretch of Dakota grassland where a girl once ran barefoot and felt the world was wide open, was gone. The frontier had been legally closed for 64 years. The covered wagons were in museums. The homestead claims were subdivided or absorbed into corporate farmland, and the American Library Association wanted to give Laura Ingalls Wilder a medal. She was 87 years old. Think about that for a moment. Not the award, the timing. The books that would earn this honour had been published starting in 1932, when Laura was 65 years old. She had not written them as a young woman reaching upward toward a career. She had written them as an ageing woman reaching backward, translating the specific texture of a vanished world into a language children could hold. By the time the American Library Association formally acknowledged her contribution to children's literature in June 1954, the contribution itself was decades finished. The last book in the original series, These Happy Golden Years, had been published 11 years earlier, in 1943. The honour had arrived, but it arrived the way honours almost always do. After the hardest work is done, after the people who shared the work are gone, after the effort has already quietly become history. Here is what the summer of 1954 actually looked like if you follow the facts carefully rather than the mythology. America in 1954 was a country in motion at a speed that would have been almost unrecognisable to the girl who grew up watching pass-notch logs in a Wisconsin forest. The Supreme Court had just ruled in Brown versus Board of Education. Television sets were spreading through American living rooms the way electricity once spread across the country. One household at a time until suddenly it was everywhere. A medium that would, 20 years later, produce a version of Laura's childhood so warm and so clean it would replace the books in millions of American minds was already reshaping how the country understood itself. The world being honoured in 1954 was not the world Laura was sitting inside. Her world, in the summer of 1954, was the farmhouse, the study, the desk, the chair on the other side of the room that Almanzo had sat in, the chair that had been empty for nearly 5 years now, since October 23rd, 1949. Her world was the fan letters that still arrived from children who felt, with the certainty children feel these things, that they personally knew her. Her world was a radius that had been slowly, quietly narrowing. Fewer trips into Mansfield, more time in the downstairs rooms, the physical world of a rocky ridge contracting around her as her mobility began to decline. And into that world came a medal. The Association for Library Service to Children, a division of the American Library Association, presented Laura with a special award recognising what they called her lasting and substantial contribution to children's literature. This honour would eventually be formalised as the Laura Ingalls Wilder Medal, one of the most prestigious recognitions in American children's publishing, awarded on a recurring basis to authors who have made enduring contributions to the field. Laura was its first recipient. That is the version of the story that appears in official records. Clean, dignified, landmark. Here is the part that doesn't appear in official records. According to accounts preserved in the biographical record and documented in research connected to Rocky Ridge Farm, Laura put the medal in a drawer. Not on a shelf, not on the writing desk where the books were born, not in a place of display where visitors might see it and understand its significance. A drawer. Now, the careful narrator does not overinterpret this. We do not know with certainty what Laura was thinking when she placed the medal in that drawer. Her letters from this period survive, but they do not, as far as the documented record shows, contain a direct explanation of what that gesture meant to her. It would be dishonest to claim she was bitter, or that she felt unworthy, or that she was making a philosophical statement about the nature of recognition. We don't know that. What we know is what the fact itself implies, and the fact is quietly devastating enough without interpretation. An 87-year-old woman, widowed, increasingly limited in her physical range, sitting in a farmhouse in a small Missouri town where she had lived for 60 years, received the most significant public recognition of a literary career that had already changed millions of American childhoods, and she put it away, not on display, away. There is something in that gesture that the entire documentary has been building toward without naming it yet. Think back to the desk. Ian, we first met it as the place where memory became literature. The writing surface where Laura, by hand on tablets of paper, translated the raw and sometimes brutal material of her frontier childhood into stories that felt survivable, even beautiful, to children who would never see a covered wagon. The desk was the site of creation. By 1954, the desk was something different. By 1954, the desk was where she answered letters from readers who loved the girl she had once been. It was where the fan mail arrived, children writing to Laura because they felt she belonged to them, because the books had made her feel familiar in the way that only the most beloved stories make their authors feel familiar. The desk had become the place where the past kept returning to her, in envelopes, in careful childish handwriting, or in drawings of sunbonnets and covered wagons and the big woods, and now there was a medal that the desk wasn't holding, because the medal went into a drawer, not far from the desk, probably in the same room, the same study, the same quiet space where the Little House books had been written, but not on the surface, not visible, tucked away, with everything else that didn't fit the public image of what Laura Ingalls Wilder was supposed to mean. This is where the story becomes genuinely strange, if you let yourself feel it. The American Library Association named this award the Laura Ingalls Wilder Medal. Her name on the most prestigious recurring honour in American children's literature. Her name would be given, from that point forward, years to every exceptional author who followed in her tradition, until 2018, when the association voted to rename it the Children's Literature Legacy Award, citing concerns about racial and anti-Indigenous portrayals within the Little House books themselves. That renaming and the debate that surrounded it belongs to a later chapter of this documentary. It is a living complexity that exists in historical time, long after Laura was gone and unable to respond. But in 1954, none of that had happened yet. In 1954, the award simply bore her name, and she put it in a drawer. Let's sit with the world of 1954 for one more moment, because it matters to what comes next. The Garth Williams illustrated editions of the Little House books, the ones we discussed in Chapter 3, the ones that created the visual canon that most readers today carry in their heads when they imagine young Laura, had been published the previous year, in 1953. The Sunbonnet Girl, the bright, clean pen and ink Prairie, the illustrations drawn by a man born nearly a quarter century after the events he was depicting, working from imagination and research and a 1950s sensibility. Those editions had just landed on the bookshelves of American children, so in the summer of 1954 something strange and slightly vertiginous was happening in American children's culture. The Garth Williams Laura was everywhere. Bright, young, mid-century modern in her visual rendering, available in every library, in every elementary school classroom, in every home where a mother had bought her daughter a Little House book. That Laura was 8 years old, and 9, and 13, and she was running through tall grass and helping Ma with butter and listening to Pa play the fiddle in the long evenings. She was permanent, she was frozen, she was untouched by time, and the real Laura was 87, with a declining radius of movement, in a farmhouse in Missouri, putting a medal into a drawer. 2 Lauras. That was always the truth of this story. But in 1954, the distance between them had become almost impossible to measure. Here is something worth saying plainly, because the documentary has been careful so far and earned the right to say it plainly now. Recognition is not the same as being seen. Laura received recognition in 1954, the formal institutional acknowledgement that her work had mattered, had lasted, had changed something. After that recognition was real. It was deserved. No one who has ever read the Little House books to a child, or had them read aloud in a classroom, or held a worn paperback copy of The Long Winter and felt the cold of a Dakota blizzard through the prose, no one would argue the recognition was unwarranted. But being seen is different. Being seen means someone looked past the Sunbonnet Girl, past the Prairie mythology, past the illustrated children's editions, past the award with your name on it, and noticed the actual woman, the 87-year-old widow, the woman with the dark manuscript in the desk drawer, the one about the baby who lived 27 days, about the diphtheria that crippled Almanzo's hands, about the house fire, about the first 4 years of a marriage that were nothing like the bright warm ending of these happy golden years suggested. Nobody gave that Laura an award in 1954, that Laura put the medal away. And here is what no one told you was coming, which is where this chapter ends. The manuscript in the desk, the first 4 years, was not the only thing Laura was sitting beside in those years. There was something else accumulating at that same desk. Letters, hundreds of them, from children across America. Children who wrote because the books made them feel they knew her. Children who addressed their letters to Laura Ingalls Wilder, Mansfield, Missouri, with the confidence of someone writing to a friend. She answered them, by hand, at the desk where the books were written. In the same study where the unpublished manuscript waited in its drawer and the medal waited in its drawer, Laura Ingalls Wilder answered letters from children who thought they knew her story. They knew the story she had chosen to give them, not the other one. And that distinction between the story she gave and the story she kept becomes everything in the chapter that follows. Because by 1955, the world was not only getting smaller around Laura, something else was changing. The correspondence from publishers was changing. The nature of the attention aimed at Rocky Ridge was changing. And Laura's own body was beginning, quietly and without announcement, to do what bodies do after 88 years of blizzards and debt and survival and grief and fame. The desk was still there. The manuscript was still there. The chair on the other side of the room, Almanzo's chair, empty now for 6 years, was still there. And Laura was still sitting with all of it, in a house she'd refused to leave since the century before this one, waiting for something she may not even have been able to name. Next chapter, the world shrinks to a farmhouse. The farmhouse shrinks to one floor, and the question that has been waiting since October 1949, about what a woman does after she has outlived her own story, begins to find its quietest and most devastating answer. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no good name in English. It is not the loneliness of being alone in a room. It is not the loneliness of being misunderstood or forgotten or left behind. It is the loneliness of being the last person who remembers something the way it actually was, when the world that held that memory has already moved on so completely that even the grief for it feels irrelevant. By 1955, Laura Ingalls Wilder was living inside that loneliness. The medal was in the drawer. The chair beside the stove was still empty. The desk sat in the study where she had written 8 books by hand. 8 books that had become, without any dramatic announcement, a permanent part of American childhood. And the world outside the farmhouse window in Mansfield, Missouri, was moving at a speed that had almost nothing to do with anything Laura had ever known. Not because Laura was bitter about it. The surviving letters suggest she was not a woman given to bitterness. But there is a difference between accepting a world you cannot recognize and feeling entirely at home inside it. And by the middle of the 1950s, the gap between the world Laura had come from and the world that was now outside her window had become something more than historical. It had become personal, intimate, felt in the bones. Here is what that gap actually looked like. The same year the American Library Association gave Laura her award, 1954, the United States Supreme Court handed down its ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. America was fracturing and rebuilding itself simultaneously. Television sets sat in more than half of American homes by 1955. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. The interstate highway system began construction in 1956, systematically paving over the dirt roads, the horse trails, the exact kind of terrain that Laura had described in her books as the landscape of an entire way of life. The world of horses, oil lamps, handwritten letters, and community barn raisings. The world that the Little House books had encoded, preserved, and distributed to millions of American children was not merely changing. It was being replaced at industrial speed. And Laura sat in Rocky Ridge Farm and answered the letters. This is not a complaint about Laura's life. The surviving record does not support the image of a woman raging against modernity or collapsing under its weight. But it does support something quieter, and in some ways more difficult. The image of a woman who had spent her entire career describing a world that no longer existed, watching it become, in real time, something stranger than she had imagined. Not a memory, not a history, a brand, a curriculum, a tourism destination, a children's section staple in every library in the country. The books kept young Laura alive forever. The real Laura kept getting older. You need to understand what the historians mean when they say Laura's world was shrinking, because it is easy to hear that phrase and picture something dramatic. A sudden collapse, a clear before and after. It was not like that. It was gradual. It was the kind of thing you might not have noticed from the outside, watching it happen in increments across a year, then 2 years, then 5. According to what the Rocky Ridge Farm Museum has documented, and what biographers including Caroline Fraser have noted in Prairie fires, by the mid-1950s Laura was spending more time in the downstairs rooms of the farmhouse, and her trips into Mansfield itself became less frequent. The range of the world she could physically move through was contracting quietly, the way a room fills slowly with water, not all at once, but steadily, and with a kind of inevitability that is almost worse than sudden flooding. She was in her late 80s. Her eyesight had been giving her difficulty for years. Her mobility was increasingly limited. These were not dramatic medical crises, not yet. They were the ordinary grinding accumulations of a body that had worked hard for nearly 9 decades, that had survived blizzards and crop failures, and a diphtheria epidemic and a fire and childbirth, and 64 years of marriage and the particular physical labour of a working farm. The body was doing what bodies do. It was wearing down. But here is what made it different from ordinary aging. Every time the circle of Laura's physical world shrank a little, every time a trip into Mansfield became harder, every time the distance between the farmhouse and the rest of Mansfield felt a little longer, the farmhouse itself grew more present, more significant, more the whole world instead of just the centre of one. And inside that farmhouse, the things that had always been there were still there. Almanzo's chair, the desk, the manuscript she had never published, the letters from children who thought they knew her. The world was getting smaller. The house was getting larger. In the way that empty things always do, we need to return to something, because Chapter 4 introduced it, and the story it belongs to is not finished. The manuscript of the first 4 years was sitting in a drawer at Rocky Ridge Farm during all of these years. The same desk, the same drawer, the same unrevised, unsubmitted, unpublished account of the first 4 years of Laura and Almanzo's marriage, the diphtheria that partially crippled his hands, the infant son who lived 27 days and died in the summer of 1889, the house fire that destroyed nearly everything they had built. Laura had not sent it to a publisher. She had not revised it for the children's series format. She had not, as far as the historical record shows, ever discussed it publicly or indicated to anyone that she intended to release it. It sat in the drawer the way certain things sit in certain places, not exactly hidden, not exactly forgotten, but held, kept, lagt så, maintained in a specific kind of suspension that is not the same as hiding and not the same as letting go. Here is what we know. The first 4 years is written in the third person. Every other Little House book is written from Laura's first-person perspective, intimate and immediate. This one is not. Biographers note that the third-person voice suggests the manuscript was never revised for publication, that Laura wrote it as a working draft, the way you might write something to get it out of yourself, and then stopped there. The question of why she never sought to publish it is one the historical record cannot fully answer. The honest answer is, we don't know with certainty. Pamela Smith Hill and Caroline Fraser both acknowledge the manuscript's existence and its darker register, but neither biographer claims to have found a letter where Laura definitively explains her choice. The reasons may have been many. The material was raw. The specific grief of a dead infant son was not something that fit inside the emotional architecture of a children's series. Or perhaps she simply decided, privately and without explanation, that some things are written to survive inside a drawer and not on a library shelf. What we do know is this. The manuscript was found in the desk after Laura's death. It was published by Harper & Row in 1971, 14 years after she died. And when readers encountered it, they discovered a version of Laura's story that the Little House books had never contained. Not the hardship that builds character story, not the warmth of the frontier story. Something harder than that, and something that does not resolve. The manuscript had been in that drawer for all of Laura's years at Rocky Ridge after Almanzo died, through 1950, 1951, 1952, through the new Garth Williams illustrations, through 1954 and the medal, through 1955 and 1956 and the shrinking world. It was still there. This is the part that rarely gets told. During these years, while Laura's physical world was narrowing, while the farmhouse was becoming the primary theatre of her daily life, she was still answering fan letters, by hand, in her own handwriting. Children wrote to her constantly. They wrote because they had read the books, because a teacher had assigned Little House in the big woods or on the banks of Plum Creek, because an older sister or a mother had read the books aloud, and the stories had lodged somewhere permanent inside them. They wrote because they felt they personally knew Laura, because the girl in the books felt that close, and they were writing to a woman who was 88 years old, who had buried her husband 6 years earlier, who could no longer easily travel into Mansfield, who was living in a farmhouse with a dark manuscript in a drawer and a chair by the stove that nobody sat in anymore. The records show she wrote back, not every letter, not always at length. But the documented fact is that Laura maintained a correspondence with readers and publishers through these years, that the desk where she had written the books by hand, on tablets of paper, was also the desk where she maintained the ongoing work of being Laura Ingalls Wilder, which was not the same work as writing the books had been. Writing the books had been the act of turning private memory into public story. This was something different, the act of maintaining a public identity that had, by the mid-1950s, taken on a life completely separate from the woman at the desk. Children wrote to Laura the pioneer girl. The woman writing back was not a pioneer girl. Stop for a moment and feel the weight of this specific fact. By 1955, by the time Laura was 88 years old and spending more of her days in the downstairs rooms of Rocky Ridge Farm, she was almost certainly the last living person who had been present for all the events documented in the Little House series. Pa, Charles Ingalls, had died in 1902, Ma, Carolyn, in 1924, Mary, the blind sister, in 1928, Carrie in 1946, Grace in 1941, the neighbours, the homesteaders, the children who had attended Plum Creek School, the people who had lived through the long winter in De Smet alongside the Ingalls family, gone. The community that had made the specific, irreplaceable texture of that world, gone. The frontier itself, legally declared closed since 1890, was now 65 years in the past. The claim shacks, the dugouts, the surveyed homesteads, the specific topography of land that the Ingalls family had moved across repeatedly, transformed, absorbed, paved over, or turned into the kind of historical site that people visit with cameras. What that means, practically, is this. Every winter from 1949 onward, Laura Ingalls Wilder was the only person left alive who remembered Pa's fiddle as a physical sound rather than a literary image. She was the only person who retained an actual sensory memory of what the big woods smelled like in the morning, what the prairie wind felt like against a face that had not read about it in a book, but had stood in it. She was the last person who knew what Charles Ingalls' actual voice sounded like when he laughed. The books had distributed that world to millions, but the living memory of it belonged to one woman in a farmhouse in Missouri, and that memory would end when she did. The records don't show her speaking about this directly, at least not in any surviving document the biographers have surfaced. But the silence of the historical record on this point is itself part of the story. She did not, as far as we know, write letters about the weight of being the last witness. She did not document the experience of carrying a world alone inside a diminishing body. She kept answering the children's letters. She kept the manuscript in the drawer. She stayed. During these years, Rose Wilder Lane was not living at Rocky Ridge. That is documented fact, and it matters, not as an indictment, but as a description of reality. Rose had her own life, her own residence, her own career. She was one of the three foundational figures of modern American libertarianism, alongside Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson. Her political writing, The Discovery of Freedom, published in 1943, remained in print. She was an accomplished journalist and travel writer, with a career that had never depended on her mother's fame. She was intellectually brilliant and politically passionate, and she was living, during these years, as separately from the farmhouse in Mansfield. Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, presents the mother-daughter relationship as genuinely complicated, intellectually intertwined, financially important to both women, emotionally fraught in ways that the surviving correspondence suggests without fully illuminating. Pamela Smith Hill's work gives more weight to Laura as a capable and independent writer in her own right, and argues against overcrediting Rose with the creation of the books. William Anderson's archival collections allow the letters themselves to carry the argument. What the historians agree on, the relationship between Laura and Rose was not simple. What they disagree on, the precise nature of Rose's editorial role and the emotional texture of the distance between them in these final years. The documentary cannot resolve what the scholars have not resolved. What it can say is this. During the years when Laura's world was growing smaller, the one person who shared both the real story and the literary one, who knew the actual history and the shaped history, who had been inside both, was not in the farmhouse. There was correspondence, there were visits. The record of those visits in the years between 1950 and 1955 is not fully documented in public-facing sources, and the honest approach is to acknowledge that gap rather than fill it with inference. What we do know is that Rose's involvement became more active as Laura's health began to visibly decline, which brings us to the part of this story that most people have never heard, The autumn of 1956, Thanksgiving. Rose Wilder Lane arrived at Rocky Ridge Farm for the holiday and found her mother delirious. This is not a metaphor. It is not a dramatic retelling. It is the documented fact. Laura, who was 89 years old, was in a state of mental confusion when Rose arrived. The diagnosis that followed identified the cause as undiagnosed diabetes, combined with cardiac failure. Undiagnosed. That word deserves a pause. It means that for some period before Rose's arrival, weeks, possibly months, Laura's body had been doing something serious and wrong, and nobody had identified it. Not because anyone was negligent in some obvious culpable way, but because Laura lived in a small Missouri town in 1956, where routine medical monitoring of elderly women was not the same as it is today. Because she was an independent woman who had always managed her own health as she had managed everything else, by enduring it, by working through it, by staying. Because the symptoms of unmanaged diabetes can be gradual and quiet and easily confused with ordinary old age. The records don't show what those months looked like exactly. They don't show us Laura noticing something wrong and saying nothing, or not noticing at all. The silence of that period is itself part of the story. What we know is the outcome. Rose came for Thanksgiving, found her mother in crisis, and Laura was hospitalized. Christmas Day, 1956. Laura Ingalls Wilder was in the hospital. December the 26th, 1956. She came home, back to Rocky Ridge, not to Rose's house, not to a medical facility. Back to the farmhouse she'd arrived at in 1894 and never left. The word home appears in the Little House books the way a heartbeat appears in a chest, so constantly present that you stop noticing it and only recognise it when it stops. Home in the books is warmth. It is Ma's voice and Pa's fiddle and the specific smell of a log cabin in winter. It is the thing the family is always seeking, always building, always one bad winter away from losing. It is the emotional centre of the entire series. The promise that if you survive long enough, if you work hard enough, if you love the right people with enough stubbornness, you will eventually arrive somewhere you can stay. Rocky Ridge Farm was where Laura arrived. But home, in the final years of Laura's actual life, meant something different than it did in the books. It was not warmth and family and the sound of other people moving through the house. It was a farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri, in the winter of 1956, where a woman recovering from undiagnosed diabetes and cardiac failure had chosen to return after being discharged from the hospital the day after Christmas. Where the chair by the stove had been empty for 7 years, where the desk held a manuscript nobody had read, where the fan letters from children who loved the girl in the sunbonnet were stacked somewhere, waiting. She came back to it. That is the thing. After the hospital, after the diagnosis, after the holiday spent sick and frightened, she came back to it. Because for Laura Ingalls Wilder, home was not a feeling. It was a decision. It was the same decision she had made in 1894 when they arrived with $100 and 40 acres of rough Ozark land and decided to stay. The same decision she had made in 1949 when Almanzo died and the farmhouse became hers alone and she did not leave. You do not walk away from the thing you spent your whole life proving you could build. Her letters suggest, and biographers have noted, that Laura expressed the wish to live to be 90 years old. Because Almanzo had. Not a dramatic statement, not a final chapter declaration, just a quiet, practical, deeply human desire to reach the age that the person she had loved for 64 years had reached, to arrive at the same number, to match him in at least that one small way, now that she could no longer match him in anything else. February 7th, 1957. Laura Ingalls. Wilder turned 90 years old in the farmhouse she had lived in since 1894. The records don't give us a detailed account of how that birthday was spent. Yeah, whether Rose was there, whether neighbours came, whether there was a cake, a letter, a phone call, a particular moment of anything. The historical record goes quiet here in a way that feels almost respectful, as if even the documentation understood that some things do not need to be witnessed in order to matter. She had reached it, the number she wanted, the same age as Almanzo. 3 days later, on February 10th, 1957, Laura Ingalls Wilder died in her sleep. She died in the farmhouse. That is the documented fact. In her sleep. In the house she'd refused to leave for 63 years. The same house where she had written the books by hand on tablets of paper, where the desk still stood in the study, where Almanzo's chair was still beside the stove, where the manuscript of the first 4 years, the book about the dead son and the fire and the crippled hands and the years that did not resolve, was still in the drawer. The death certificate identifies the cause as the conditions that had been building since the autumn of 1956, the diabetes, the cardiac failure. She was 90 years old. She had survived everything the frontier had ever put in front of her. She had outlived her husband, her sisters, her parents, virtually every person who had shared the physical reality of the world she spent her career preserving. She had watched that world become a brand, a curriculum, a legend, and a controversy, all from the same farmhouse. And then she died quietly. The manner of the death is the most important thing about it, and it is not a dramatic thing. There was no deathbed scene, no last words on record, no documented final revelation or confession or goodbye. She went to sleep and she did not wake up, and the house was still there in the morning, and she was not in it anymore in the way that matters. There is a particular kind of honour in that. Not the honour of a dramatic ending. The honour of a life that was internally consistent all the way through, quiet, stubborn, private, and rooted in the specific piece of Missouri ground she had chosen and refused to abandon. She died the way she lived. 3 months. That is approximately how long it took for Rocky Ridge Farm to become a museum after Laura Ingalls Wilder died. According to museum records, the homestead, including the farmhouse and the rock house that Rose had built with her own earnings in the 1920s, opened to the public around May 1957. The legal structure for this transition had already been in place. As established earlier in this documentary, Laura and Almanzo had sold the farm property itself to a farmer named Shorter back in October 1948, retaining only a life estate, the legal right to live there until they died. When Laura died on February 10, 1957, the life estate ended. The formal ownership of the property had already passed out of Wilder hands years before. What had not passed was the meaning of the place. The farmhouse that visitors walk through today, the study with the writing desk, the preserved rooms, the belongings arranged as Laura left them, is the physical continuation of a life that had already become legend while the person living it was still inside it. That is a strange thing to stand in, if you think about it. The museum preserves how the home appeared in Laura's final years, though any preservation involves curation, and curators make choices about what to show and how to show it. What the preservation cannot entirely capture is the specific quality of the silence after February 10th, 1957. The silence of a house that had held 63 years of a woman's daily presence, writing, corresponding, remembering, aging, staying, and then did not anymore. Rose Wilder Lane outlived her mother by 11 years. She died in 1968 and is buried beside her parents in the Mansfield Cemetery, beside Almanzo, beside Laura. The woman who had helped shape Pioneer Girl into the Little House series, who had built the rock house at Rocky Ridge with her own money, who had arrived at the farmhouse that Thanksgiving and found her mother delirious and gotten her to a hospital. She is there, in the ground, 3 graves in a row in a small Missouri town, and the scholarly argument about what exactly passed between them is still unresolved, and probably always will be. We planted 3 things early in this documentary: Almanzo's chair, the desk, the word home. The chair is still at Rocky Ridge Farm. The museum preserves it as part of the interior that reflected Laura's final years. 7 years it sat empty after Almanzo died in 1949. Through all the winters Laura stayed, through the new Garth Williams illustrations of the books, through 1954 and the medal, through the shrinking world of 1955 and 1956, through the hospitalization and the return and the birthday. The chair was there through all of it. The chair is not a symbol, it is an object. What makes it devastating is not any meaning anyone assigned to it, but the simple, factual, impossible to avoid reality that it was there, and the person who sat in it was not. That is all. That is enough. The desk is still there too. The manuscript was found in it. The fan letters were answered at it. The books were written at it. Whatever Laura was, in the final 7 years after Almanzo died, correspondent, celebrity, widow, last witness, aging woman, keeper of a dark manuscript, she was those things at that desk. The desk did not change. The work it held changed completely, and the word home. The Little House books taught a generation of American children what home meant: warmth, family, survival, belonging, the safety of a lit window at the end of a long day, the sound of a fiddle, and the specific feeling of being inside a place you chose and that chose you back. But the real final definition of home, the one Laura lived rather than wrote, was simpler and harder than any of those. It was this: the place you will not leave, even when leaving would be easier, even when the person who made it feel like home is no longer there, even when your body is failing and the world outside has become something you barely recognize, and the chair beside the stove is empty, and the manuscript in the drawer has never been read by anyone but you. You stay because it is yours. You stay because you built it. You stay because home, at the end of a life lived the way Laura Ingalls Wilder lived hers, is not a feeling. It is a fact. Here is the question this entire documentary has been building toward. We remember Laura Ingalls Wilder as a little girl in a sunbonnet on a Wisconsin prairie. That image, frozen, warm, permanently childhood, is the image America chose to keep. It is the image on the book covers, in the school curricula, in the cultural memory of a nation that needed its frontier story to feel clean and survivable and resolved. But the real Laura kept aging past that image for 83 years. She was 65 when the first book was published, 76 when the last one in the original series came out, 82 when Almanzo died, 87 when the medal came and went into the drawer, 89 when Rose found her delirious at Thanksgiving, 90 when she died in the house she would not leave. The books preserved childhood forever. The real woman survived long enough to become elderly, widowed, Ina physically slower, and quietly separated from the world the books described, not bitterly, not dramatically, but completely, and in a way that almost nobody stopped to notice while it was happening. There is a particular kind of courage in living a long life inside a myth about yourself. In answering letters from children who love the girl you were, knowing that the girl they love cannot answer back because she is not the person holding the pen. In placing a medal in a drawer not out of indifference but because the medal recognizes something that happened, not something that is happening. In keeping a dark manuscript in a desk because the world that produced it belongs to you alone, and you are not ready, or perhaps simply not willing, to share it. The farmhouse stood. The chair stayed empty. The desk kept its manuscript. And the woman who had spent her entire career turning the hardest years of her life into something children could love and carry into their own lives, died quietly in the place she'd chosen, on the third morning after the birthday she'd wanted to reach. That is the story America forgot to finish. That is the real ending of Little House. Chapter 6 will examine what happened to Laura's image after 1957, how the mythology deepened, how the television series transformed her story into something she would never have recognized, and what it means that the most comprehensive biography of her life, Caroline Fraser's Pulitzer Prize-winning Prairie Fires, was not published until 60 years after she died. The real Laura had been gone for decades before anyone thought to look for her. What they found, when they looked, was harder and more human and more worth knowing than the sunbonnet girl ever was. There is a strange kind of violence in being remembered wrong. Not a dramatic violence, not something you could point to in a courtroom or argue about in a newspaper. Something quieter than that. The violence of simplification, the violence of a culture deciding which version of you is useful, preserving it, and quietly letting the rest of you disappear. Laura Ingalls. Wilder died on February 10th, 1957, in the farmhouse she had lived in since 1894. She was 90 years old. She had spent the last 7 years of her life answering fan mail by hand, sitting beside an empty chair, carrying the weight of being the last living witness to a world that had already become myth. 3 days after she died, America kept right on remembering her as a little girl in a sunbonnet. And here is what that looked like, and what it cost. 3 months. That is approximately how long it took for Rocky Ridge Farm to become a destination. According to museum records, the homestead, including the farmhouse and the rock house that Rose had built with her own earnings in the 1920s, opened to visitors around May 1957, roughly 3 months after Laura died in February. The legal structure for this transition had been in place since October 1948, when Laura and Almanzo sold the farm property to the Shorter family while retaining only the right to live there for the remainder of their lives. When Laura died, that right ended. The practical arrangements moved quickly. What that means, if you let it land, is this. The house where a woman had spent 63 years living, loving, writing, grieving, aging, and refusing to leave, became a tourist attraction within a season of her death. That is not a criticism. It is a fact about how cultural mythology is built. The people who organised the museum presumably loved Laura, presumably wanted to preserve what she'd left behind, presumably understood that the farmhouse and its contents, the desk, the belongings, the preserved study where the books were written by hand on tablets of paper, were irreplaceable. The impulse was probably the right one. But there is something worth sitting with in the image of strangers walking through Laura's rooms in the spring of 1957, while the woman who had lived inside those rooms had been gone for barely 100 days. The house was ready. The myth was already waiting. Before we can understand what happened to Laura's image after 1957, you have to understand what America needed her to be in the first place. The Little House books arrived in 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression. Families who were losing farms, leaving homes, unable to feed their children. They picked up a book about a family that lost farms, left homes, and couldn't always feed their children, and yet kept going. The books didn't lie about hardship. They turned hardship into something bearable, something that could be survived, endured, outlasted. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous cultural service. By the time the 1940s brought World War II, the books had been woven into the fabric of American childhood. By the 1950s, they were assigned in schools, shelved in every public library, and used, consciously or not, to illustrate something Americans wanted to believe about themselves, that the frontier spirit was real, that pioneer values were enduring, that the America of covered wagons and claim shacks and the family prayer had produced something durable enough to survive the atomic age. Laura was not merely a children's author by the 1950s. She was a cultural function, and cultural functions require consistency. They require the image that works, the one that serves the purpose, that fits the curriculum, that makes children feel connected to something larger than themselves. They do not particularly require the full, complicated, aging, widowed woman who put a medal in a drawer because it didn't recognise the parts of her life that mattered most. The books kept young Laura alive forever. The real Laura was inconvenient. In 1971, Harper & Row published the first 4 years, 14 years after Laura died, 14 years after Rose had gone through the farmhouse, 14 years after the desk had been catalogued, the belongings preserved, the study prepared for museum visitors who would look at Laura's writing surface and picture the warm, triumphant creation of the Little House series. The manuscript was found in the desk drawer, the same desk, the same drawer that had held it through all of Laura's widowhood, through 1950, 1951, 1952, through the Garth Williams re-illustrations, through 1954 and the medal, through the shrinking world of 1955 and 1956, through the hospitalization and the return and the birthday and the death. Nobody, as far as the documented record shows, had known what to do with it while Laura was alive, and Laura, for her part, had made her decision by never submitting it. When it was finally published, readers discovered something the Little House series had never contained. The first 4 years is the only book in the sequence written in third person, because it was never revised, never shaped for the children's format, never run through the process of transformation that turned raw memory into emotionally manageable literature. It covers the first 4 years of Laura and Almanzo's marriage, the financial failure of the early farm years, the diphtheria epidemic that partially crippled Almanzo's hands, the death of their infant son who lived for 27 days in the summer of 1889, and the fire that destroyed their house shortly after. That book does not resolve. It does not arrive at resilience. It ends where it ends, not with triumph, not with warmth, but with two people still standing, still trying, in a way that is harder and more honest and less comforting than anything else Laura ever published. The manuscript had been in that drawer all along. America didn't find it until more than a decade after she was gone. That gap is not accidental. It is the shape of what the myth required. Rose Wilder Lane outlived her mother by 11 years. She died in 1968, and she is buried in the Mansfield Cemetery alongside Almanzo and Laura. 3 graves in a row in a small Missouri town, and the scholarly argument about the exact nature of what passed between mother and daughter is still unresolved on the day this documentary is being written. What Rose did in those 11 years, in terms of how she managed, presented, protected or shaped her mother's legacy, is a question the historical record answers only partially. What is documented is that Rose had been, throughout her own career, an intellectually formidable and politically passionate woman. She was a journalist whose travel writing had taken her across Europe and Asia, decades before the Little House books existed. She was one of the 3 foundational figures of modern American libertarianism, alongside Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson. Her own book, The Discovery of Freedom, published in 1943, remained in print after her death. Rose was not simply Laura's daughter, she was a figure of significant intellectual consequence in her own right. Biographers differ on what that meant for the books. Carolyn Fraser's Prairie Fires, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography published in 2017, presents a detailed examination of Rose's editorial involvement and argues that the relationship between mother and daughter was genuinely complicated, financially intertwined, intellectually interdependent, and emotionally fraught in ways the surviving correspondence suggests without fully resolving. Pamela Smith Hill's work, particularly her annotated edition of Pioneer Girl, gives more weight to Laura as a capable and independent writer who developed her craft deliberately. William Anderson's archival collections let the letters themselves carry the argument, and the letters are careful, layered, resistant to simple summary. What is not disputed by any of these scholars is that the collaboration existed, that Rose encouraged Laura to write, that Rose helped shape Pioneer Girl into the children's series format that became the Little House books, that the mother-daughter dynamic was something more intricate than simple support and something less dramatic than exploitation. What Rose did with that complexity after 1957 is a story the documentary record does not fully tell. The honest answer is, we don't know everything. The Rose Wilder Lane papers at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, contain primary source materials that scholars have mined carefully. But the inner life of what it meant to outlive your mother and watch her become, in the decade after her death, an increasingly simplified icon, that is not in the archive. That is in the silence between the letters. 17 years after Laura died, a television producer named Michael Landon, looked at the Little House books and saw something that could work on NBC. The series, Little House on the Prairie, ran from 1974 to 1983. 9 seasons. 50 million viewers at its peak, by some estimates. It reached an audience that vastly exceeded the readership of the books themselves, and it created a visual and emotional template for Laura Ingalls Wilder that has proved almost impossible to dislodge. The television, Laura was warm and perpetually victorious. The Ingalls family on screen faced hardships that were reliably resolved by the end of each episode. Pa was wise and gentle and physically present in every crisis. The prairie was beautiful, the family was safe, the story kept ending well. The outline used in developing this documentary is explicit on the instruction that the NBC series must never be used as biographical evidence. This is the correct instruction, and here is why it matters beyond mere academic precision. The biographical Laura's actual experience, the one documented by Fraser, Hill, Anderson and Miller through letters and archives and probate records and museum documentation, bore a complex and often contradictory relationship to what Landon's production showed. The real financial desperation of the Ingalls family, which was severe and persistent. The real complexity of the family's time in Kansas, which involved living on Osage diminished reserve land in a legally and ethically complicated way that the books themselves did not address, and the television series certainly did not. The real darkness of the marriage years covered in the first 4 years, the manuscript that sat in a drawer, which contains none of the warmth the television version projected onto the same period. Rose Wilder Lane was still alive when the NBC series was being developed in the early 1970s. She died in 1968, so she did not live to see the show premiere. Whether she would have recognised the woman on the screen as her mother is a question the historical record cannot answer. What the historical record can say is this: the television show was enormously successful at distributing a version of Laura Ingalls Wilder to an audience of tens of millions. And the version it distributed was not the version in the farmhouse in 1955 answering letters by hand, or listening to the silence of a house that had held 64 years of marriage and now held only one person and one chair that nobody sat in anymore. That woman never made it to television. Here is the thing about the sunbonnet image, the one on the book covers, the one in the classroom posters, the one that became the primary visual shorthand for an entire era of American frontier life. The sunbonnet covered a lot. It covered the fact that the Ingalls family's time in Kansas, documented in Little House on the Prairie, was on land that had been reserved for the Osage people under a federal treaty, and that the squatter settlement of that land was neither legally straightforward nor ethically uncomplicated. And Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires addresses this with the kind of detail and scholarly rigour that the books themselves, shaped for a 1930s children's audience, never attempted. It covered the death of the infant son. Charles Frederick Wilder, born in August 1889, died 27 days later. He exists in the Little House series only in the manuscript that stayed in the drawer. In the published, curated, curriculum-approved version of Laura's life, he does not exist at all. It covered the specific texture of what homesteading actually cost in physical, psychological, and financial terms. The Minnesota Historical Society notes that Laura smoothed, altered, and simplified events from her real life when creating the fictional Laura. That is not a moral failing. It is the fundamental act of every writer who has ever transformed autobiography into literature. But it means that the books, however honest their emotional register, were also shaped by the purposes they were meant to serve. And it covered the old woman, the 82-year-old widow, the woman who answered letters from children who loved the girl she used to be, the woman who put the medal in the drawer, the woman who came home from the hospital on December 26, 1956, and refused to leave the farmhouse even as her body was failing, the woman who turned 90 on February 7, 1957, in a house that had been quiet for 7 years since Almanzo died. The sunbonnet was a useful image. The old woman was a harder one. Something happened in 2017 that the documentary cannot skip past. Caroline Fraser published Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. The book won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography. It is, by scholarly consensus, the most comprehensive and rigorously sourced biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder ever written, a work that spent years in archives, cross-referencing letters and probate records and newspaper accounts, and the Rose Wilder Lane papers at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, building a portrait of Laura's actual life that is more complicated, more difficult, more interesting, and more human than anything the Little House mythology had previously allowed. Fraser's book was published 60 years after Laura died. Not 6, not 16, 60. That gap is worth sitting with. A woman died in 1957. The most thorough scholarly reckoning with her actual life. The version that includes the real financial desperation of the Prairie years, the real complexity of the mother-daughter collaboration, the real darkness of the manuscript in the drawer, the real texture of what the frontier experience cost the people who lived through it, arrived in 2017. In between, the sunbonnet image held. The television show ran for 9 seasons. The book stayed in school curricula. The medal that had been renamed in Laura's honour kept getting awarded every few years to new children's authors. Laura Ingalls Wilder was one of the most recognised names in American children's literature for 6 decades. And the full story of who she actually was, the life behind the sunbonnet, waited in archives and drawer manuscripts and probate records in Wright County, Missouri, for most of those 60 years. That is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and in some ways more troubling, the natural tendency of cultural mythology to preserve the version of a person that is most useful. and to set aside the version that complicates that usefulness. In June 2018, the American Library Association announced that the award bearing Laura's name, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Medal, established in 1954 when Laura was alive, the one she placed in a drawer, would be renamed the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The stated reason involved concerns about the portrayal of Native Americans and Black Americans in the Little House books, representations that the ALA's governing body determined were not consistent with the values the award was meant to represent. The announcement generated significant public debate that has not been fully resolved, and the documentary's outline is explicit that this moment should be handled with exactly the care it deserves. Neither as a cancellation story nor as a vindication story, but as evidence of something the documentary has been building toward from the first chapter. Here is that something. America's relationship to Laura Ingalls Wilder has always been a negotiation between what the books provide, which is genuine and valuable and real, and what the books cost, which is also genuine and real. That negotiation was not visible in 1932, when the books first arrived in the middle of the Great Depression, and millions of families needed exactly the emotional sustenance they provided. It was not fully visible in the 1950s, when the books were assigned in schools as illustrations of pioneer heritage. It became more visible in 1971, when the first 4 years showed readers a version of Laura's life the series had not contained. It became more visible still in 2017, when Fraser's biography laid the full complexity of the record on the table. And in 2018, the negotiation became public in a way it had never been before. Laura is not here to participate in that conversation. Her books are. Her documented choices are. Her letters are. The manuscript that stayed in the drawer for 14 years is. The life she actually lived, the full life, not the sunbonnet version, is the richest source of evidence for any honest assessment of what she built and what she left unfinished. The documentary's position is not adjudication, it is revelation. The real story is harder and more human than the mythology that replaced it. Both things can be true simultaneously. That the books gave generations of American children something genuine and durable, and that the image of Laura as a simple, uncomplicated pioneer girl erased a woman of far greater complexity. Because this matters more than the documentary can fully resolve in any single chapter. Fraser, Hill, Anderson, and Miller, the 4 primary scholarly voices in this space, differ in their emphases in ways that are instructive, not merely academic. Fraser's Prairie Fires is the most sweeping and most critical, examining the real economic and racial context of the frontier years with a rigour that earlier biographies did not attempt. She gives significant weight to Rose's editorial role and presents the mother-daughter relationship as genuinely troubled in ways the mythology obscures. Hill's work, particularly Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, is more focused on recovering Laura's own voice as a writer, arguing that Laura was not merely the raw material Rose shaped, but a deliberate and capable literary artist who made her own choices about what to include, what to transform, and what to put in a drawer. Hill's Laura is less a victim of mythology than an architect of it, for reasons that were her own. Anderson's letter collections allow the primary sources themselves to complicate both interpretations. The letters are careful, specific, and resistant to any reading that flattens Laura into either a passive figure or a fully realised independent literary genius operating without external influence. The truth, as the letters suggest it, is somewhere in the layered middle, which is where the most interesting human truths always are. Johnny Miller's Becoming Laura Ingalls Wilder focuses on the transformation from woman to legend, on the processes by which a real person becomes a cultural symbol, and on what that transformation costs. It is a book that speaks directly to what this documentary is about. What they all agree on, the real Laura is more interesting than the version America kept. What they disagree on, the precise distribution of credit, blame, agency, and consequence. The disagreement is itself part of the historical record, proof that the story is alive, thus is still being worked through, still generating the kind of scholarly friction that means something matters enough to argue about. The farmhouse at Rocky Ridge is still there. The museum, which opened in May 1957, continues to receive visitors in Mansfield, Missouri. According to the museum's documentation, visitors can still see Laura's study, her writing desk, and many personal belongings left as she left them. The desk has not moved. It is still in the study where Laura wrote the Little House books by hand, on tablets of paper, in the 1930s and 1940s. It is still in the room where she answered fan letters from children who loved the girl she used to be. It is still in the house where the manuscript of the first 4 years was found in a drawer after her death. The darkest book, the one that does not resolve, and the one that spent decades in a drawer before America was ready to read it. The desk sat through all of it. Through the widowhood years, through the museum opening, through the television series that Laura never saw, through the Pulitzer Prize biography that arrived 60 years after she died, through the renaming of the award, through all the arguments, all the assessments, all the ongoing national negotiation about what the Little House books mean and cost and gave and took. The desk does not participate in any of those arguments. It just sits there, in the study, in the farmhouse, in the small Missouri town where a woman arrived in 1894 with $100 and the refusal to stop. That is the real story. Not the sunbonnet, not the television show, not the mythology, or the medal, or the controversy. The desk, the drawer, or why, the manuscript, the chair that nobody sits in, the house that a woman refused to leave because it was the only proof she had that she had survived everything, and she was not going to walk away from proof like that. We began this story on October 23rd, 1949, in a farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri. A man died, a woman stayed. The world only remembered the girl. We have walked through 7 years of widowhood, the letters answered, the medal placed in a drawer, the world shrinking one autumn at a time, the body failing quietly while the fan mail kept arriving from children who thought they knew her. We have watched America freeze Laura forever at 7 years old, while the real Laura turned 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90. We have watched the mythology build, the museum that opened 3 months after her death, the television series that reached 50 million people, with a version of the story that would not have been recognizable to the woman who lived inside it, the 60-year gap before the fullest biography arrived, the ongoing scholarly argument about what she built and what it cost. And here, at the end, is the question this documentary has been building toward from the very first sentence. What does it mean to spend your entire life preserving the feeling of home for millions of strangers, and to die in one silent farmhouse, holding the last living memories of a vanished world, and then to be remembered by the culture you preserved as someone who never aged? The Little House books gave generations of American children something real, something durable, the feeling that hardship is survivable, that home is worth building, that the specific texture of a life, even a difficult one, even a lost one, is worth preserving in language before it disappears. Laura gave them that, and in return, America gave her immortality as a child. She deserved to be remembered as what she actually was, a woman who survived almost everything, who wrote the hardest parts of her life into something children could carry, who kept a dark manuscript in a drawer because some truths are not for public consumption, who put a medal in a drawer because recognition is not the same as being seen, who stayed in a farmhouse in Missouri long after the man who helped her build it was gone, because home, in the end, was not a feeling. It was a fact, and the farmhouse is still there, still standing, and still holding in its preserved study and its unmoved desk and its documented silence the fullest version of a woman that America spent 60 years learning how to see. This is where the story of Laura Ingalls Wilder ends. Not on the prairie, not in childhood, not in the warmth of a television studio in 1974. It ends in a farmhouse in Missouri, in the quiet of a life that was more complicated, more surviving, and more worth knowing than the mythology ever admitted. That is the ending nobody told you. Now you know it.